You may need to turn your connection on, so
Okay.
there's not any background.
Sure,
But go
sounds
ahead.
good. Okay. So welcome to all who have gathered today with us in person and virtually. Rolf, our moderator, and I decided that I could give the briefest of introductions here. And you've seen the progress of our leadership team having a spring of interest in learning more about our ecumenical neighbor, the United Church of Christ. And so in realizing that we had that interest and wanted to invite the congregation to learn more about that body of Christ, we know that we also want to learn about our rootedness in Congregationalism. And for many of us, that has come in recent decades of our lives. Some of us are rooted from birth or from younger years, but we have so much to learn about the rich history of Congregationalism and of the United Church of Christ. And in contacting the Minnesota Conference of the United Church of Christ to find someone who might be able to teach us a bit about that body and its intersections with Congregationalism, I thought of my instructor. Some years ago, I was pregnant with Sam. So 8 or 9 years ago, I was in Reverend David McMahill's class where he is an instructor through United Theological Seminary on UCC history and polity. And it was certainly something I needed to learn to become ordained in that body of the church. And so I know him to be very pastoral and warm and also thoughtful and bright. So I'm so glad that you said yes to being someone who could teach us some hopefully new things to many of us today, David. So thank you for being here, and thank everyone for having gathered today. And I would just finally like to open us in a bit of a word of prayer, of gratitude and openness. So wherever we are, let us pause our forks and pause our thoughts and conversations, and let us just join in a moment of prayer. Oh God, thank you for today. Thank you for an opportunity of new beginnings with covenanting with our new members, and also a new beginning in this moment in any of our lives of learning about our rich tradition of Congregationalism, learning about a sister body of the United Church of Christ. Please be with us. We offer gratitude for the abundant food resources we have access to and are grateful for this lovely meal to share together. So be with us in spirit of gratitude, grace, and curiosity. Amen. Take it away, David.
Well, thanks. Well, when I was first asked to do this, my plan was to be with you in person, to worship with you, and then do all of this in person. And then last week, middle of the week, my temperature went up and throat was sore, and I thought, oh boy, now what? What plan B are we going to work on? And when Claire told me that Zoom was a possibility, that really relieved my mind. I'm not. It wasn't COVID, but it is some kind of virus, and I was fearful that I might pass it on to some of you, and I sure didn't want that to happen. So I'm glad for Zoom. I was able to participate in your worship service as it was streamed online, and I mentioned this to Pastor Claire. What a wonderful, warm, inspiring service that was. Wow, it was just great all the way around. Well, I want a couple of caveats before launching into what I want to share this morning. And maybe I should check out, since we got a late start. We were originally looking at a 12 or 12:15 end time. Are we still kind of at that, Claire, or what should we think of in terms of end time?
Let's try to end as soon afternoon as we can, just as that's
Okay.
people's expectations, but we'll go
Okay.
a bit longer as we're finishing up at that time. Sure.
Sure. All right. I'll try to break it at a reasonable place then. Okay, a couple of caveats before launching into this. I retired from my work in the Minnesota Conference of the United Church of Christ at the end of 2005, and then taught at United Theological Seminary for another 8 years, and then taught the same class online. But in the intervening years, there have been quite a few modifications of the United Church of Christ in terms of structures and programs and the like. And some statistics that were once on the tip of my tongue because of my employment might not be accurate any longer. And so like memberships, budgets, and that kind of thing. But such information is generally available online anyway. And the other caveat is that the class that Claire referred to took 2 semesters. And so we'll be doing in this session and on April 20th, what took normally two semesters to cover. So this will be rather brief, quick brush strokes of stories that I think are really, really interesting. And again, a fair amount of this is also available on the United Church of Christ website. I will mention that on the UCC website, that the history that is written there does not take into account more recent developments, particularly around structures of the United Church of Christ. So you have to look a little bit further into some other buttons on the site. I'm thinking that I will probably urge the national offices to update that history. I'm afraid if I do that, they'll say, okay, David, go for it. But we'll see. All right. So the story of how the United Church of Christ came into being is often characterized as mergers of 4 separate denominations: Congregational, the Evangelical Synod of North America, German Reformed Church in the US, and the Christian Convention. And while talking about those 4 is generally accurate, I do want to acknowledge that there were also more than just a small handful of other groups that found their way into the United Church of Christ. I largely am going to focus on these 4 with the greatest emphasis on the congregational side of it all. But I do want to acknowledge that among the other groups that came into the UCC were groups that were organized mostly around nationalities. In other words, there were 17 at the founding of the UCC. There were 17 Armenian congregational churches that became part of the UCC. I did not know that until back in the early 1990s. My wife and I were serving the UCC church in Northfield, and we had a seminary intern who was from one of those Armenian churches. And boy, I learned a lot that I hadn't known before. There were a group of Hungarian Reformed churches in the United States that are part of us, and some German-speaking churches, Germans from Russia, who settled in the Dakotas and Nebraska and were adopted by the Congregational Home Society back then. So it's more than just the 4 denominations. If you want to know more about them, a resource that I ask all of my students to read is 2 volumes called The Hidden Histories of the United Church of Christ. And it's interesting reading for you. So, okay, to get us thinking about congregational history, need to take us back. Well, actually, all 4 of the denominations. I need to take you back quite a ways, back to the time of the Reformation. We're not going to spend a lot of time on the Reformation, but the Reformation, which we sort of think of it starting around 1517 AD when Martin Luther posted his 95 protests on the wall of the Wittenberg Chapel. But there were some issues in the Roman Church at that time. Let me just name those issues because this is the soil out of which came Congregationalism. The first was that Rome claimed to control salvation. In other words, your present and future relationship with God. That teaching had gone back several hundred years. And so, folks who believed that the church was the only route to a relationship with God really were powerless to do anything else. Yeah, think about that. Rome said it had the power to control your relationship with God. Second was Rome prohibited lay people from reading or even owning scripture. Third one was that Rome claimed that divine inspiration could come only through the hierarchy, in other words, through the Pope and the archbishops and the bishops in the priests. But that the average lay folk, were not going to be a source of divine inspiration. Rome claimed control over all matters of faith and doctrine, and corruption was absolutely rampant because of the power of the church. The phrase "power corrupts" and "absolute power corrupts absolutely" was coined in thinking about where things stood with the Roman Church. And finally, only bishops and priests could handle holy things. The role of lay people in worship was simply to observe, to watch the holy drama reenacted by the priests, who were, of course, all men. So there were voices of protest before the official Reformation. One of my heroes is Father John Hus, who 100 years before the Reformation was burned at the stake for challenging Rome's claims. I've always had trouble wrapping my head around the fact that the church in those days had the power to execute somebody. That's just hard for me to grasp. Well, so the early reformers, Luther, Calvin, Zwingli, and such, objected to all of those things from Rome. They said that the basis of our relationship with God, present and future, is God's grace given to us through Jesus. And that the sign of that free, unmerited grace is the new covenant. This cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is shed for you. These reformers said that all Christians should own and read scripture. They said that doctrine should come from a study of scripture and not from edicts from Rome. And that leaders of the church, get this, leaders of the church should live morally clean lives. And finally, that the Holy Spirit was believed to be present among all worshipers. Now, here's the thing, though. The early reformers kept the concept of a church hierarchy alive, with control over teachings and doctrine. And the interesting thing was, in those days, where you lived determined what you believed. You were a part of this church because you lived in Germany. You were a part of that church because you lived in Sweden. But the concept of hierarchy was still there in those early Protestant churches. Well, so when Henry VIII was King of England, and this very, very confusing story about whether England was a Protestant nation or a Catholic nation, and they kind of went back and forth. But in 1534, Henry VIII wanted the divorce, which the Pope would not grant, and so Henry VIII said, "Okay, we're just going to leave the Catholic Church and start the Anglican Church." The Church of England was established with the king or the queen being the governor of the church. Henry named Thomas Cranmer, Archbishop of Canterbury, to be the religious head of the church, but it was, once again, a hierarchy. Now, in that context is where early Congregationalism was birthed. There were several different thinkers, Robert Brown and Henry Ames and others in England at that time, who said, wait a minute, the church is not this hierarchy. The church is made up of the gathered community of believers. And these are followers of Jesus, as opposed to the church having to be constituted by the hierarchy. And that the gathered community of followers is the body of Christ on earth, charged with continuing the ministry and mission of Jesus Christ. And because our relationship with God is based on God's grace given to us in Jesus, the church exists directly under the headship of Jesus Christ and should not permit any church or civil authority to intrude in that relationship. So Congregationalists, and I include myself in this, have always been very suspicious of higher authority. And that's where that suspicion comes from. Those early Congregationalists said then the glue that holds each gathered community together is covenant. It's not an order from on high. It's the covenant between churches and within churches. And that covenant is to be a reflection of God's covenant with us in Jesus. In other words, a covenant of love, genuine care and concern for one another, and recognizing that it is the grace of God that unites us. I couldn't help but think of that as you receive new members this morning in worship. And Pastor Claire used the term covenant a fair amount in that service. And that's, you are doing this morning exactly what Congregationalists have done now ever since Congregationalism really came into being in New England, in England all those years ago. Now, there was one other thing that these early Congregationalists said that has gone by the way. I'm glad it's gone by the way, and that was that the church was supposed to be made up of what they called regenerate believers who could demonstrate a saving experience. These folks were Calvinists, and Calvin taught that when you're born into this world, you're a sinner. And if the only way to get beyond your state as a sinner is to be saved literally by the grace of Jesus Christ. And you had to demonstrate that that saving experience had happened before you could be part of the church. Well, fortunately, after Congregational made its way to this country in the mid to late 1800s, that requirement disappeared rather significantly. Okay, so under the reign of King James in the early 1600s, remember King James he's the one that authorized the King James version of the Bible that so many people have loved. Under his reign, congregational teaching was heresy and illegal. King James wanted people to treat him as the head of the church, and one of his famous phrases was, those Congregationalists will either leave the country or they will leave this earth. Yeah, and he meant it. He meant it. So in spite of that, there were essentially two groups of Congregationalists that emerged. One were the Puritans. The Puritans were people who, they were originally called purifiers, who wanted to purify the Church of England. They really weren't interested in leaving the Church of England so much as purifying it. But they recognized that they might not get anywhere doing that. So they asked for permission to leave and establish a new society in America at that time, which then became known as the city set on the hill with the eyes of the world will be upon us. In addition to the Puritans, there were the separatists who made it known that their mission was to separate themselves from the Church of England. We know them today as the Pilgrims, who thought that the purifiers were naive and just plain wrong. But so the both the Puritans and the Separatists, or the Pilgrims, wound up in this country. The Separatists had to leave England under threats from King James, so that they first went to Holland before leaving for America. Their pastor, John Robinson, spoke to them saying, God has yet more light and truth to break forth from his holy word, by way of encouraging them to work with the Puritans when they got to America. The Separatists came to America on the Mayflower. Along with, on the Mayflower, there's a kind of a ragtag group of non-religious types as well. They signed the Mayflower Compact before getting off the boat, which was essentially a description of how both the church and society was going to work in the colonies. So what that meant was that in colonial years, what became known as the Congregational way was also the way of society and government. In those years, there was no separation between church and society at first. In fact, if you wanted to be elected mayor of a village, you had to be a member of the Congregational church. And in order to be a member of the Congregational church, you had to demonstrate this saving experience to the satisfaction of the pastor. So Congregationalism in those years pretty much controlled society. Again, a lot of that has evolved, and some of that's gone away over the years. Well, by 1640, the leaders of Congregational churches recognized how important it was that they worked together, that they needed to develop some kind of system of connecting with each other. So they came together in Cambridge, Massachusetts, to write the Cambridge Platform that stated some basic beliefs, but even more stated the need for Congregational churches to work together. To become important aspects of mission, such as starting new churches as the nation expanded, protecting churches from scoundrels, and creating excellent schools to train clergy and to provide religious instruction for new members, and for the general betterment of society. And so those early Congregational people, among other things, started Harvard University, Yale University. My alma mater, Dartmouth, was started as a Congregational mission to the Native Americans in New Hampshire. By the early 1800s, several other developments drew Congregational churches closer together than ever before. One of the most important was the sending of missionaries overseas. In 1812, the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions was created, and they sent a group of missionaries to India, and it launched an amazing global effort of sending missionaries all over the world. And that effort, not only did it impact the nations where missionaries traveled, but also brought about a dramatic change in churches back in the States, especially in the area of women's leadership. There was an interesting phenomena that happened to support missions. There was a women's society that grew up in Congregational churches called the Least Coin Society, or the Cent Society, where women would contribute the least coin that they had on them every time they came together. And if it was a penny, okay, it was a penny. If it was a nickel, all right, they would contribute that. But amazingly, the least coin societies of women only raised a lot of money for foreign missions. And by the end of the 1800s, the men who were, sort of in charge said, you women ought to turn over all those funds to us and let us distribute them as we see fit. And the women said, no way. We will control the raising of these funds, and we will control how they are spent in support of mission. One of the first strikes for the equality of women's leadership. One of the other things that helped to draw congregational churches together was the Abolitionist Movement in protest of slavery. Now, I should say that in each of the four major denominations, there were strong abolitionists in all of them. But some of the congregational abolitionists were an amazing group of people. One of my favorites is Lewis Tappan, who was a businessman in, I think, New York, who traveled all over the country for the cause of abolitionists. As an abolitionist, one story was told about Lewis Tappan that he carried a little pocket-sized Bible in his shirt pocket, and once when he was traveling in the South trying to advocate the cause of liberty for the slaves, somebody shot at him, and the bullet lodged in that Bible right over his heart. He would have been killed were it not for his Bible. Now, when I told that story to my students at United Seminary, some of them said, "Oh, come on, that's hokum." I don't know, neat story. But in any case, Lewis Tappan and others were strong abolitionists, and in the process, like I say, drew congregational churches closer together. Then, following this, a new organization within the Congregational Church emerged called the American Missionary Society, the AMA, whose goal was to start schools all across the South for newly freed slaves. The AMA started something like 500 schools across the South, and that are still open today. Houston Tillotson, Lemoyne Owen, Tougaloo, Tuskegee. These are the predominantly Black colleges, but draw their origins back to the American Missionary Society, founded by the Congregational Church. Once again, the Congregationalists found themselves drawn together because of the need to plant new congregations at the edge of the frontier and to plant new schools at the edge of the frontier. I mentioned earlier that my wife and I had served First United Church of Christ in Northfield. Well, it was Carleton, which is there, was originally started as a congregational school. And it was a group of Congregationalists in that church who lobbied, I think it was the Home Mission Society of the Congregational Church, to put the college in Northfield as opposed to in 2 or 3 other towns in Minnesota that were competing. So in any case, planning new congregations, planning new colleges, again, helped to draw the churches even closer together. So by the 1900s, the Congregationalists resembled other denominations in having national and state offices for purposes of carrying out mission. But the big difference is that this was not a hierarchy. Again, the folks in those days were true to the congregational way, with authority staying in the local church. Emphasis is still on these these elements of congregationalism, the non-transferable responsibility of local churches to discern God's will for that congregation. In other words, living under the headship of Jesus Christ. And the covenantal relationship within congregations, among congregations, and with conferences and national expressions. Congregationalists developed a ministry of oversight, which is what happened in conferences. And it was seen to be supportive, guiding, unifying, and when needed, protecting role. The term that they used was a visitation of love rather than disciplinary authoritarian role. Well, so in 1931, the Congregationalists merged with the Christian church to form the Congregational Christian churches. But wait, who were these Christians? Before I launch into the Christians, let me pause and see if there are comments or questions about what I've done so far.
What was the name of your book again?
My book? Or
The one you recommend all your students read?
Well, actually, I recommended that they read a lot of books, but
Yeah.
Hidden Histories of the United Church of Christ. It's in two volumes. Yeah, Hidden Histories of the United Church of Christ.
The Given?
Hidden Histories, HIDDEN.
Given.
Hidden Histories of the United Church of Christ.
That's one, okay.
Yeah, and like I said, it's in two volumes. They thought they could get it all told in one volume, and gee whiz, the more they researched, the more they discovered there were more stories to be told. Okay, any other questions before I talk about who this Christian convention? Okay. All right.
Did you want to ask a question?
I was just wondering if you'll get into the theology in this talk today, the evolution of the theology of the Congregational or church.
Well, it was at first pretty much a Calvinist theology that said, as I mentioned very briefly a little bit ago, that when you arrive on this earth, you were born a sinner, and that the only way that you can deal with that is by having a saving experience through the grace of Jesus Christ. Now, Calvin also said something else that people really struggled with a lot, and that was that only some were destined to be saved, and others were destined to be doomed. Predestination was part of his teaching, and folks struggled with that an awful lot. But so the idea then theologically was that the church was made up of these supposedly predestined saved people, and that created all kinds of complications for the church. There were, so you would have this couple, this family that would join the church, and they would describe this saving experience, and so they were received in, and then their children came along, and the children could not describe such an experience. Did that mean they couldn't be part of the church? And what about the grandchildren? Did that mean they couldn't be part of the church? And so they developed for a while this thing called the halfway covenant, which essentially meant that children and grandchildren of saved believers could sort of be members of the church, but not full members of the church. Now, I want to say that by the late 1800s, most of that theology was was vigorously argued down. One of the strong advocates, Horace Bushnell, wrote this famous book called Christian Nurture, where Bushnell argued that children raised in a Christian home are not, by definition, sinners when they arrive on this earth. If they can be raised with Christian teaching and ought to be brought into the church as full members, when they are confirmed at a age of 13 or 14. And it was a real sea change of thinking, and the thinking has continued to evolve. I find it so interesting now that in the United Church of Christ, one of our favorite phrases is, no matter who you are, no matter where you are on life's journey, you are welcome here. Boy, contrast that to the theology back in the 1600s that said, nope, you are not welcome here unless you've been saved. So yeah, there's been some real evolution. The teaching about, say, such things as the sacraments, the Protestant church has acknowledged pretty much ever since there's been a Protestant church, two sacraments, Holy Communion and baptism. Now, interestingly, the theology of baptism has evolved a fair amount as well. And in the Congregational church, for the most part, infant baptism was practiced and accepted. There were other groups in colonial America and even up to now that say no, the only real form of baptism is baptism by immersion. There's something called believer's baptism at age 13, 14, 15, somewhere in there. So that probably does not do real justice to all the theology, but does that at least, I don't know who asked the question, but does that at least
I think
help a little bit?
Will probably evolve across the next session too, as we hear about theology.
I'm sorry, can't hear you. I'm sorry, I couldn't hear.
Okay, I was just saying that probably the conversation will continue as you and Reverend Ashley both join us next time talking about theology of the UCC and of the Congregationalist churches.
Yeah. Well, okay, so wanted to talk a little bit about the second group, the Christian church. The Christians of the four were the only homegrown group. In the mid 1700s, to some degree as a result of this social and cultural phenomenon known as the First Great Awakening, in three parts of the country, there emerged groups of very similar ideas. At first, they didn't know about each other, but similar ideas about Christian faith and about the church. They were highly independent types who said, among other things, that to name a church anything but Christian was idolatrous. And they, whether you called yourselves Congregationalists or Methodists or Presbyterians, all of those were idolatrous, that the church ought to simply be called Christian. And they said that any creed that was written by humans was idolatrous, that the Bible was their only creed. And they said that bishops, archbishops, and the like got in the way of their right and their responsibility to read and interpret faith for themselves. And they said that good character and a desire to further the mission of Christ was the only requirement for membership, and that the unity of the church was imperative. Well, these groups, like I say, in the South, in New England, and somewhat in the Midwest, found each other largely through a newspaper published in New Hampshire called the Herald of Gospel Liberty. The editor of the Herald of Gospel Liberty was Elias Smith, who was not shy about telling it like he saw it. But these three groups formed something that was at first called the Christian Connection in the early 1800s. And in spite of themselves, they began to look like and act like a denomination all throughout as they grew during the 1800s. There was a similar group that called themselves the Afro-Christian Church that had formed among African Americans, both during and immediately following slavery. And they were brought into this Christian Connection. And the Christian Connection, they kind of changed their name to the Christian Convention. Because of their belief in the unity of the church, they reached out to 5 or 6 other denominations for union talks in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Including the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. You would have thought that those uniting with each other would have been a slam dunk, but in fact it wasn't, because in those days the Disciples of Christ said that you had to be immersed as an adult, young adult, in order to come into the church, and that was a deal breaker. But finally, when the Christian Convention found the Congregational churches, they found a receptive audience and eventually merged in 1931 to become the Congregational Christian Church. So then, just a few years later, in 1938, a Congregational Christian pastors and Evangelical Reform pastors and teachers were meeting together in St. Louis, and they discovered a great deal of common ground. But wait, Evangelical and Reform, who were those people? Well, way too briefly, the Reformed part of Evangelical and Reformed were Germans who came to the US from Germany in the late 1700s. Although many were from the Reformed Church in Germany, they did not come as a church like the Pilgrims and the Puritans did. Most of them came as refugees from the wars that had just been devastating Europe. Read some of the histories of the wars in Europe in the 1700s. It is just staggering to see how many people were killed and the devastation that occurred from those wars. Many of the Reformed people landed in Pennsylvania, some in Wisconsin, some in Indiana, some in Ohio. They did not have trained, ordained pastors with them, but they found each other and gathered themselves into congregations that were largely led by lay members for some years. One of my heroes in that group was a fellow called John Philip Boehm. He was a German Reformed school teacher and a lay leader who was persuaded by his congregation at Faulkner Swamp, Pennsylvania, to lead a service of Holy Communion. Well, according to German Reformed theology, lay people did not do that. But when you didn't have an ordained pastor, what do? So he led the service of Holy Communion, and that got him in some trouble with the Dutch Reformed Church, which did have a presence here. But Boehm was not a rabble rouser, not a rule breaker on purpose. So he agreed to take instruction from the Dutch Reformed Church, did become ordained, and eventually the German Reformed people formed their own systems here and grew enough to start a seminary, now Lancaster Theological Seminary in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, a UCC school. And they started a number of social service agencies and institutions. In the evangelical part of ENR were also Germans who arrived in the early to mid 1800s. They landed largely in Missouri and Southern Illinois. In their early years, they were assisted by missionaries from Europe, from the Basel and Barmen missionary societies, and were incredibly grateful, so much so that when they became strong enough, they became donors back to these missionary societies and gave, one book says, gave way out of proportion to their membership. In fact, the evangelical people became strong donors for many things. They were not necessarily wealthy people. They were just very generous with what they had. They started Eden Theological Seminary in Webster Groves, Missouri, which continues to be one of our strongest seminaries for the UCC. They started Emmaus. I'm sorry, what? Oh, okay. They started Emmaus Homes in St. Charles, Missouri. Emmaus Homes is a large residential facility for persons with mental retardation and other disabilities, which, was when it was founded, it was way ahead of its times in terms of the kind of education it provided for persons with mental retardation. And they started the Back Bay Mission in Biloxi, Mississippi. Back Bay Mission is an incredible social service agency that still functioning strong. The current conference minister in the Minnesota Conference came to us from the Back Bay Mission. She had been the executive director, and came here. Emmaus Homes in St. Charles. Let me tell you just a quick story. At a General Synod meeting, I don't know, maybe 15, 20 years ago, the meeting was in St. Louis area. And for one of our worship services, a choir from Emmaus Homes sang. Gracious, about 40 or 50 people who sang The Impossible Dream. And I say, even telling that, I was in tears when they were done. It was such a powerful experience. Back Bay Mission in Biloxi is a place that people from the congregation where I'm a member, UCC New Brighton, every year we send people down there for a 2-week work camp, working on either building homes or upgrading homes in the area for low-income people. Back Bay has an incredible both witness and incredible impact on the low-income people in Biloxi. So in any case, in 1934, the evangelicals and the Reformed people merged to form the Evangelical and Reformed denomination. That was a fairly easy one. German-speaking, many similar beliefs of theology. They tended to have what some Congregationalists thought was a little more conservative theology, but I'm not sure that that's really accurate. They both used the Heidelberg Catechism for confirmation instruction. In worship, they did use some of the classical creeds quite a bit, like the Apostles' Creed, or the Augsburg Confession, or the Nicene Creed. So in any case, I do want to mention that the evangelical and reform people, in addition to the ones that I've already named, started many, many other human service institutions around the country. Here in Minnesota, what is now St. Paul's United Church of Christ, the church that Pastor Clare served before coming to Peoples, about 100 years ago, started St. Paul's Church Home in St. Paul. At the time, it was one of the finest nursing homes in St. Paul. Now, sadly, age caught up with St. Paul's Church Home and it had to be closed about 20 years or so ago. But members of St. Paul's UCC had formed a separate independent organization called St. Paul Family Resources, which started and now manages Oak Meadows, an independent and assisted living facility in Oakdale. And they felt it was very important that the Minnesota Conference of the United Church of Christ be involved. So I was on the board of directors for Oak Meadows for 5 or 6 years at its beginning. And when I retired, other conference staff took my place on the board of directors. At one time, the hope was to transfer the nursing home license that they'd had for the St. Paul's Church Home to a new nursing home next to Oak Meadows, but for regulatory reasons that I never did understand, this turned out not to work. Well, although the evangelical and reform people were Calvinists like the Congregational people to begin with, they did have a significantly different church structure, which is what made the union with the UCC both a challenge and a gift. The ENR people had a hierarchy of sorts. Decisions made by the wider church, particularly their synod, were binding on local churches. That made Congregationalists very nervous, as you might imagine. So the story of how the merger talks went and were finally consummated in 1957 is a long, long story that will take far more time to tell than we have. Some of that story is on the UCC website under the tab History. It was a hard process marked both by fear and by great patience and great faithfulness. At one point, when folks were not sure that it should even move forward, the chair of the committee that was working on merger talks asked people a simple question: is it the mind of Christ that we continue these merger talks? If the answer is yes, then we will continue. If the answer is no, then we will say, been nice knowing you, and we'll all go home. And then he asked folks to go into their own private space for a matter of about half an hour and pray about that question. And they did. And when they came back together, unanimously, the answer was yes, it is the mind of Christ that we continue these conversations. And so, there was a significant turning point in the process, which actually came during a legal challenge. Opponents of the merger said that the General Council of the Congregational Christian Churches had no authority even to engage in merger discussions without having been authorized to do so by local congregations. The General Council of the Congregational Christian Church replied that, in fact, it could act on its own authority to carry out merger talks, although Congregational Christian congregations would have to make up their own minds about whether to be part of this merger and vote one by one by one by one, which is what happened. Now, here's the key phrase. The General Council of Congregational Christian Churches, they said, was in effect like a local church, being able to speak for and act for itself without anyone telling them they could do so.
Yep, I know.
Okay, all right. I'm back.
Sorry.
All right.
I
that's
had to
okay.
mute everybody else.
Yep. I understand. Thanks, Dale. So the reason I describe that is not to dredge up unpleasant stuff, that unpleasant part of history, but to say that the concept of each part of the church having its own authority to act for itself is still very much how the United Church of Christ does things. So, for example, when the General Synod of the United Church of Christ, which is a gathering of delegates from conferences every other year, when they pass a resolution about one thing or another, it is General Synod speaking for itself only and to the churches and to the society beyond the church. So, when I was on the Minnesota conference staff, one of my frequent duties was to counsel congregations who were between pastors. Every time I met with the appropriate committee, a search committee or the council or whomever, I would start by saying the strongest word I can use here is recommend. Now, sometimes I really recommend something vigorously, and I'll let you know why. But I can't make you do what you don't feel like God is calling you to do. So, in 1957, at that uniting synod in Cleveland, Ohio, delegates were not voting on a new constitution. Instead, delegates there said that the first formal action that they wanted was to have a new statement of faith, which happened and was received and ratified 2 years later. Brief footnote here, Congregational Christian churches did not have a constitution and bylaws at all. Even Evangelical Reform people did. But you know who was more anxious to draw up a constitution for the new United Church of Christ? It was the Congregational Christian people who really wanted things spelled out and who had seen some of the downsides of not having such a document. But back to the statement of faith. The statement of faith is in the New Century Hymnal. Do I understand that that's the hymnal you use at People's Church?
Yeah.
Yes, that's what I thought. Okay, it's in the New Century Hymnal. The statement of faith is not a test of faith. In other words, it is not the prescribed theology of the United Church of Christ. It is often referred to as a testimony, not a test. It may be used in worship. It may be used in orienting new members to kind of the theological ethos of the UCC. It can be used as a study document or as a guide for, say, a confirmation class. When the original statement of faith was written between 1957 and 1959, issues around gender inclusive language were just not in the thinking of those who wrote it. A little more than a decade later, issues of gender inclusive language did show up, and President Robert Moss offered a revised version with inclusive language, which he wrote while he was in a hospital bed near death from cancer. And then a few years after that, it was revised again in the form of a doxology, which kind of took care of the inclusive language challenges. Now, I believe all three of those are in the New Century Hymnal. I like the statement of faith a lot. The reason I like it is this. Most of the classic creeds, Apostles' Creed and Nicene Creed and Augsburg Confession, speak about who God is. This statement of faith speaks about what God has done. And as we recognize what God has done, it helps us to recognize what God is still doing and is still speaking today. I will mention, interestingly enough, one of the curious differences between former Congregational churches and former ENR churches is that the ENR folks nowadays often do use the statement of faith in worship. Not very many Congregational Christian churches do. That's not 100% true, but it's just kind of how the heritage of each of those denominations plays out in local congregations. Okay, I am at a point where I was going to then launch into how the United Church of Christ is organized and a little bit more about what's going on in the UCC these days. This would be a good breaking point where I can go on for a little bit here and then save the rest of what I was going to do for April 20th. Claire, Ralph, give me some feedback about where we ought to go. It's almost noon.
Dana, I don't think you can hear me, but why don't you say, let's get a little taste and we'll leave it next time.
Can't hear you, Claire.
She's suggesting maybe wrap up in about, what, 5
Get
minutes?
a little taste and leave within a few minutes after 12.
If we can wrap up within a few minutes after 12.
Give us a little
Okay.
taste.
Give us a little taste.
I guess a preview.
Preview.
Sure. Well, okay. So let me just tell you what where this is going. I think it would be important for folks to know how the United Church of Christ is organized, how we're structured from local churches up to the national church. Because it's not a hierarchical organization, it's really tough to draw up an organizational chart. Every so often in my history and polity classes, I would ask students to try to draw an organizational chart for the United Church of Christ. And some would start by, well, here's the president, and then here's the general synod, and then down here are the local churches. And then they would get to that point and say, wait a minute, that just isn't right. That's not right at all. How do you draw an organizational chart for a non-hierarchical church, which we are? It tends to resemble more of a wheel. One of the values that's very significant in the UCC is that the local church is seen as the basic unit of the United Church of Christ, and that the local church, every local church, operates under the headship of Jesus Christ. Every local church is asked to do its own discerning, and then acting in covenant with other local churches. There are many things that it's just far better for us to do together than each one of us trying to do these things all ourselves. I will be at some point going to be talking about how the United Church of Christ is financed. I want to talk also about, let's see, about the comma. Let me see my shirt here. The comma with God is still speaking. That has become a very interesting part of United Church of Christ identity in the last 20 years. But I don't have time to tell that whole story now. So maybe what I should do is to say, okay, this is about how far we'll get today, and see if there are questions. Listen, one thing that I would, oh, I'm sorry, there was a question that showed up on chat. I just lost it.
Do you see it?
Okay. My question, do we know what were the expressed reasons why churches like People's chose not to join the UCC back in 1957? I don't know about Peoples. In fact, I was wondering that myself. Folks who have been part of Peoples will have to answer that one. There were a variety of reasons that some congregational churches chose not to join the UCC. There were fears. There were fears of losing the congregational way. There was concern about, well, I do know there were some who thought that the new denomination was going to take over ownership of church buildings, and that was not true. But there were those who thought that was going to happen, and that's what influenced their decisions. There were some who were just really loyal to Congregationalism and just did not want to lose that sense of loyalty to Congregationalism. There's an interesting book entitled The United Church of Christ by Douglas Horton, that essentially what this book did was to talk about each of the elements in the UCC, the Constitution and bylaws that were approved at the very beginning of the UCC. And he has a little history about some of what went into the merger discussions. And at one point he said, New England boiled dinners needed to come to terms with Pennsylvania sauerkraut, which was his way of saying there were some cultural things that people just had to learn to deal with. Oh, okay, I see. PCC history does not document the reasons for not joining, and members who would know are dead. By the way, there are some churches, continuing congregational churches, who voted no, and there were others who never voted. And I don't know which way it was with People's, if it was a vote no, or if it was a we didn't vote. So yeah, I don't know. I do know that one of the other National Association churches in Minnesota, fairly large church, considered joining the UCC in my last few years of working with the conference, and it looked like they were going to move in that direction. And then there were some folks who were really, really, really loyal to Congregationalism, who essentially said over my dead body, and so they didn't even vote. They just called off the process. So yeah, a lot of it has to do with loyalties.
Okay, well, is there maybe one more question in the room or the Zoom room, and then we'll close up? Any question? And seeing none here, seeing none there. I think this is wonderful to be in a learning process. And so we'll have an ample 2 hours on the evening of the 20th. We'll have a half hour for brunch, and then, for dinner, and then we'll move into the hour and a half of which David and Reverend Ashley Clear will share about the life and continued progression of the NACCC and the UCC. So we'll look forward to learning more on that evening. Hopefully you'll be able to be with us in person, David. We'll see. Grateful to Dale for managing the Zoom.
Yeah, I sure hope so. If I'm not feeling well by April 20th, something's haywire. I don't know. Yeah, and just to be really clear, I do not look upon having both of us being part of the learning session. It's not a debate. We're both going to be sharing our experience of our respective bodies, and let you folks make up your minds as good Congregationalists do.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for your presence here today. And thank you, David. Take care all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Okay, bye.
I am not dead. And is whoever said all the people are dead. That
For sure.
But
Was it a Hilliard who said they're all dead?
I think, Claire, the minutes of the meeting are upstairs in the files
Are
from when
they?
they voted.
In the 1950s?
Yeah.
Okay. That's what she just said.
isn't it?
Okay, Paul and Dale, awesome AV here, guys. I suppose that didn't just
That's the story. that I-
happen on its own. So thank you for taking the time to set it up. I was wondering what it would be like to have it presented. It was just great.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. I mean, I had,
Speaker is really good.
The
I,
speaker
the
was
speaker's
very,
great. The mic is a little particular as to who it picks up. Like Mary Ann was loud and clear on that mic, and she was way back there, and they couldn't hear Claire. I think because people were in the way. It really is sensitive to a direct line, so that's one thing to keep in
well,
mind.
your undoubtedly time and attention was, I
thank
really
you.
appreciate it. So
I,
thank you.
I am not a techie, so I don't know how I got in this.
You got a good, you got
Well,
got a
and
thing
our
going here.
Our son Drew is. And
Oh,
so
yeah, well, let's get Drew here.
There's our connection.
Did you know he's got this job as an IT support
I was thinking of-
at
I was thinking
Augsburg,
about
but he
it.
supports Luther Seminary 2 days a week and 3 days a week at Augsburg. And Rolf and I are like, yes, let him meet someone from Luther.
Yeah.
He's a single. Of course, we think he'd be a catch for some young woman.
I'm sure he would.
But yeah, we'd
Okay.
love to have him come here someday.
That would be nice. Be great to see them both again. And I was talking to Ralph the other day, and he was telling me that Andrea is sort of going back and forth from Atlanta to LA because she's got this love interest, and
So she's known him 8 years.
that's a long time.
And then, he went and got his master's and his PhD and was in New York, and then she was in, anyway, and somehow they reconnected last year, and they're inseparable, so maybe, we'll see.
Yeah. Okay.
It's a complicated, it's complicated, but people live complicated lives.
True. 8 years says something.
Well, they met 8 years ago, so they,
And then they reconnected.
yeah, so I don't know the whole backstory, but we met him, he's very.
You listen, yeah, I'm amazed. You listen. to,
Okay, well,
people.
Thank you.
thank you so much for all
Okay.
your extra work.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Getting very used to him, but like I feel like some people.
Yeah.